Hello, this is Mr. Coates, and this is APES Lecture number 7. This is going to be on cycles of matter, also known as the biogeochemical cycles. When we look at the planet, we can look at this. This is a picture of Earth from the moon, and basically you don't see anything around us. We are by ourselves. We can't get any of these things that we make our stuff from or that we need from any other place. We have to get it from the planet. If we even go even further, then we are this little speck right out here from Saturn. This is from the Cassini spacecraft, and this is a little bit closer from Mercury here. But we are still a little dot out in the vastness of space. We can't go somewhere else right now and get the things that we need in order to either live or to make all the things that we want. So therefore, we have to get them all on this planet. And cycling of matter is the important part of this. In order for us to do all that, matter has to be cycled. We have a law that's called the law of conservation of matter. It basically says that matter can't be created or it can't be destroyed. It just changes forms. So what do we mean by changing forms? Well, let's look at this apple down here. If we remember back to chemistry and back to knowledge of science, that everything that is matter is made up of simple form called an atom. Okay, remember, atoms are protons, neutrons, and electrons, and they bond together to form more complex molecules, and those molecules get together to make the bigger pieces of matter that we can actually see. So this apple here is made up of all kinds of matter. So there are carbon atoms in there, there are hydrogen atoms, there are oxygen atoms, there's nitrogen atoms, phosphorus atoms, there's probably some sulfur in there, there's iron, there's probably some other things in there too that I don't have here, but all these atoms make up this apple, and they are the matter that the apple is made up of. Let's say this apple falls on the ground from the tree and it starts to decompose. Remember, we cannot destroy matter. So what happens to the matter? What happens is that the bonds between all these elements, these atoms, start to break down, and the apple starts to lose its shape and starts to kind of dissolve. And we call this decomposition. And a lot of times when we think about decay, we just say that it went away. Well, that's not true, really. The matter is still there. The carbon atoms, the nitrogen atoms, the phosphorus atoms, all those atoms that made up the apple are still present somewhere on this planet. And then they are reused by something else. And that's what this biogeochemical cycling is all about. It's reusing these atoms over and over and over again. So we can have the things that we need to live, and the earth can have things it needs in order to function. So these are, like I said, are called the biogeochemical cycles. A pretty fancy word. Bio means life, so life is involved in these cycles. Geo means earth, so the earth is also involved. A lot of times these atoms are held within the earth for long periods of time. And then chemical. Like I said before, these are all things that atoms are bonded together to make different chemicals. And so the atoms will go in and out of different chemicals all the time in these cycles. Now, when we look at cycles, there are three main parts to every cycle. There are inaccessible reservoirs. These are places where the atoms or the matter stay for long periods of time. So examples are like fossil fuels, minerals in rocks that get buried, sediments in the oceans. Even some deep ocean water can be considered an inaccessible reservoir. Then we have exchange pools. So the exchange pools then are those areas where the atoms of the matter stop off for a short period of time. We're talking maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, and then get transferred somewhere else. So atmosphere is a good place, soil, some water. You could even say some organisms, such as long-living trees, could be exchange pools. And then we have the biotic community. Biotic community are all those producers, most of the plants on the planet, the consumers, everything that eats plants or other animals, and then those decomposers that break those things down. For a long time, the planet ran just fine by just having those parts. However, humans came into being, and we started messing with these cycles. And the way we did this is that we kind of short-circuited the cycle. It took a long time in nature for things in this part over here, the inaccessible reservoir pool, to get over to this part over here, to the biotic community. However, with human advances, we now can take matter from these inaccessible reservoirs and put them right back into the biotic community and these other exchange pools very rapidly. So we have sped up some of this cycling. In fact, we've short-circuited a lot of it. That's usually where we affect these cycles the most. Now, when we talk about inaccessible reservoirs or pools, we're going to maybe sometimes call them sinks. This is where they get stored, where that matter gets stored. Also, there are processes that go in between these. And those are going to be transformations where the actual atoms change chemical forms. So they'll be bonded to other elements in other arrangements to form other compounds. For example, carbon over here might be CO2, but in a transformation it might come over here and become glucose or a carbohydrate. The first cycle we want to look at is one that's fairly familiar to you. This is the hydrologic cycle, also known as the water cycle. So this is an idealized representation of the water cycle. The water cycle is actually much more complex than this, but this is what we need for our purposes. We're going to start up here at the atmosphere. Obviously, water doesn't change chemical forms. So in this cycle, water is always going to be H2O. It doesn't change into something else. In the atmosphere, we have gaseous water, water vapor. And that floats around. Sometimes it condenses and into clouds and forms precipitation, snow, sleet, rain, and that falls on the land. These arrows are going to be processes. So in these processes, you need to know what they are, how they occur, where they go from, and where they go to. In this case, the boxes here then are going to be short-term reservoirs or long-term reservoirs, and I'll go over those when we get there. So once the precipitation hits the land, it can do a couple of different things. It can get soaked into the ground. We call that infiltration or percolation, when the water gets soaked in the ground, and then that goes into the soil or the aquifers. Or sometimes it can run off into surface waters. So when you have a large rainstorm and it gets into a river, the water flows into the river into a lake, then that lake or that river is a surface water. Or it can get absorbed by organisms. Okay, remember, water is key to all organism life. In soil and aquifer, this is a long-term reservoir. Water can stay in aquifers for hundreds of thousands of years. So this might be an inaccessible reservoir for water for a period of time. However, aquifers, underground storage areas of water, actually flow and they move. And so over time, they might move far enough to actually enter into the surface water. When we get water in the surface water, it can go one or two places. It usually either gets cycled deeper down in the oceans, or it can go into the atmosphere through the process of evaporation, when the water turns back into a gas. Now, there's a special type of evaporation that occurs from plants. And during plants' normal functioning, there's a process called transpiration, where the plants lose water through their tissues. That goes back up into the atmosphere. So this is a very simple water cycle, and this is the part you need to know. Usually transpiration is the part that most students forget about. It's very important. Also, they haven't heard too much about infiltration and percolation. How do humans affect the water cycle? Where do we mess it up? Well, we mess up this part right here. We take it out of the ground a lot of times and use it faster than it normally would be. Also, because of some of our other activities, a lot of water is getting evaporated faster than normal. Irrigation is one of our biggest uses of water on the planet, and we irrigate all of our crops with it. We take it from groundwater, we take it from surface water, and consequently we change those long-term storage pools because we take so much of it out of those places. We also pollute water with all of our other activities. Water pollution is a huge problem, and once you get polluted water, a lot of organisms can't use it. It can't be used for anything else. Through wetland destruction, when we destroy wetlands, water doesn't go through its normal processes of infiltration and it just runs off. So we're kind of short-circuiting the aquifer stage in that part. Dams and reservoirs. When we dam up a river, we stop the natural flow of water and we create maybe a long-term storage pool in a lake that wasn't there before. The other biggie is climate change. With climate change occurring and the planet getting warmer, then our cycles of evaporation and rainfall all change. And so by warming up the planet, we are drastically changing the way water cycles. Our next cycle is the carbon cycle. Now we're starting to get into more complex cycles you don't know necessarily as much about. So you really need to look at these. Like I said, you really need to know these processes. You need to know the molecules that they're in and how they transform. So these processes. So we'll start in the atmosphere, is where I like to start. And carbon in the atmosphere is always in the form of CO2, carbon dioxide. And most of us have heard about carbon dioxide, but this is the chemical form of carbon dioxide. Now, about the only way CO2 can get removed from the atmosphere and incorporated into something else is through the process of photosynthesis, where plants take that CO2 and incorporate the carbons from that CO2 into their structures in the form of carbohydrates, like sugars and cellulose and starches. That's one of the major ways we can get carbon out of the atmosphere. Just plant a bunch of trees, a bunch of plants, and that'll start removing the carbon out of the atmosphere. One other way that carbon can get removed out of the atmosphere is through diffusion into the oceans over here. This is a big one. Carbon dioxide continuously diffuses back and forth into and out of the oceans. The diffusion occurs due to the concentrations. If your concentration is high in the atmosphere, then it will diffuse into the ocean. If your concentration of CO2 is high in the ocean, then it will diffuse into the atmosphere. So it just depends on where the higher concentration is. But CO2 does get locked up in the oceans in a salt called bicarbonate, and it can stay in that form for a long period of time. So this could also be a very long-term storage reservoir for carbon. Let's say the plants incorporated that carbon atoms, just like that apple did, into its structures. So at that time, then something can come around and eat that apple. We call that consumption, and the carbon atoms then are transferred to that organism. Typically, those carbon atoms are used for production of energy or the production of structures in the form of carbohydrates. So once again, they go from a carbohydrate to maybe a different type of carbohydrate, but they're still kind of carbs at that point. They might be proteins, they might be fats also. Another thing that can happen from plants and animals is that they can die or they can eliminate wastes. And so those wastes or that death also includes those carbon atoms. And those carbon atoms then, if they get buried and mineralized, they can turn into fossil fuels, which are the oils, natural gas, and coal. This is a very long-term storage reservoir down here, a very important one. Millions of years carbon can be stored in this reservoir. Only till we start mining and drilling these reservoirs do we get that carbon out. And this is where humans have been short-circling this cycle by removing carbon from that long-term storage pool and putting it right back up in the atmosphere. And this is what's causing a lot of our climate change issues. Now, the other natural way that carbon gets back in the atmosphere is through cellular respiration. When animals and plants break down those sugars or those carbohydrates for energy, they release CO2, and that goes back in the atmosphere. And that's a normal release of CO2. The planet is used to that. It's geared towards combating that CO2, and typically the amount of CO2 released here is usually equal to the amount of CO2 used in photosynthesis. The problem is all of this stuff is extra CO2, and so that's a net increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And when we get to air pollution and climate change, we'll talk a lot more about that. Ways that humans affect the carbon cycle, fossil fuel use is number one. By burning fossil fuels, we are putting a lot more carbon into the atmosphere, and that's causing, like I said, climate change problems. Burning and clearing a forest for irrigation or other purposes. A lot of the forest holds carbon. Like I said, forest can be a storage pool for carbon, and when we take those forests away and we burn them, then we lose that storage capability. And then anytime we burn anything, if we burn anything, piece of paper, a match, trash, whatever we burn, we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Well, I'm going long on this lecture, so I'm going to divide it into two lectures. So this part is going to be lecture 7A, and the next part will be 7B. If you have any questions about this cycle or the water cycle, please bring it to my attention in class and we'll discuss it.